The trouble started at 7:02 on a Tuesday night in Los Angeles, which is late by industry standards and early for a miracle. She came up the block on foot because she didn't own a car that ran, and she refused to arrive anywhere that mattered in something that smelled like the bus. Her name was Marta June Calloway, and she was 68 years old, and she was wearing a dress she had bought at a church sale in Pasadena. The kind of dress that had belonged to somebody's grandmother before it belonged to her. She had removed the tags herself with a kitchen scissors, because a woman who had run a movie theater for 48 years does not ask for charity, but she does know how to sew. The theater behind her, 5 blocks back in Echo Park, was dark. That was the part that had been hard to leave tonight. The marquee still told the truth in weather-beaten letters. Final week. The demolition was scheduled for Monday. But tonight was not about the theater. Tonight was about a piece of paper in her purse, folded into thirds, and a ticket stub inside the paper, and a promise written on the back of the stub in pencil, 40 years old now, with the pencil gone soft and gray. Before we go one step further, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Los Angeles, Ohio, Texas, Florida, maybe somewhere across the ocean. I want to see that map light up. And while you type it, I'll tell you what happened inside the Cineora that night, because nothing about that evening was what it looked like. Not the woman, not the movie star, not the man who ran the studio, and especially not the list that started everything. The red carpet ran from the curb to the doors of the Cineora, 120 feet of it, and the lights were white and hot, and the flash units popped like a lawn full of fireflies having a seizure. A woman in silver somebody Marta had seen in 3 movies, whose name escaped her at the moment, was stopped 20 feet away, turning for cameras, laughing at something a publicist whispered into her ear, and the whole machine of the night moved around her like weather around a mountain. Marta Calloway walked to the barrier. She was not afraid. Fear would have been a luxury. She had spent the last 6 days telling herself this would work. The invitation in her purse was real. Keanu's assistant had mailed it on studio letterhead, addressed to her by hand in blue ink. Marta, see you in the front row. K. She believed it. That was the tragedy of her, in a way she would not understand for another hour. She still believed things. The man at the gate was named Dale Kessler, and he looked like a man who had come to the end of many night shifts. He was 58 years old, ex-military, the head of event security for a company called Brightline. His tablet glowed. His earpiece crackled with voices he mostly ignored, because after 22 years in this job, he had learned that the voices were almost always wrong and the quiet was almost always the truth. He looked at Marta, and something in him went soft, the way it does when you see your mother's age on a stranger's face. And then he looked at his tablet, and the soft went out of him. Ma'am, your name? Calloway, Marta Calloway, I'm on the list. He scrolled. The list was long. He scrolled back up. He scrolled down again, slower, the way you check a face in a crowd twice. I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't see a Calloway. That's not possible, she said it politely. She even smiled a little because she had rehearsed being gracious. It's under Calloway, Calloway, Keanu's guest. At the name, Dale Kessler's eyes did a strange thing. They flicked to her like a man hearing a name he knew from somewhere and could not place, the way you almost remember a song or a face from a paycheck you cashed once 30 years ago. Something behind his eyes pulled at a thread, and the thread would not come. One moment. He spoke into his collar, read her name into the darkness of the earpiece, and the darkness answered. The next part happened fast, the way humiliation always does, fast on the outside, slow forever on the inside. A second guard appeared, younger, with a face that had never been surprised by anything. He took Marta's elbow, not hard, just taken the way you take a shopping cart. Ma'am, you'll need to step aside. I'm on the list. Ma'am, please. And here was the thing the crowd saw, and the thing the cameras caught, and the thing that would be played 1,000,000 times in 1,000,000 comment sections. A 68-year-old woman in a church sale dress being walked backward off a red carpet by 2 men in black, her chin up, her eyes dry, her mouth holding a smile that had gone behind glass. The woman in silver turned and looked like everyone looks, and then the woman in silver looked away, the way everyone looks away. "Ma'am, you can wait here. We'll check with the producer." "Fine," Marta said it calmly, and she stood where they put her at the edge of everything on the public side of the barrier with the flash units popping and the carpet gleaming and the doors of the Signora standing open 30 yards away like a mouth. She did not fight. She did not argue. She just stood there with her purse held against her chest the way you hold a child in a crowded room, and she said one thing very quietly to no one. Maybe to the night. Maybe to the building. He promised. That was when the small things began to line up, small things the crowd could not see and the cameras did not catch, small things that would take the rest of the night, and the next day and the day after that to assemble into an answer. Across the street, just past the barricade, stood an old man in a flat cap. He was holding a 35mm film can against his chest the way you hold a hat at a funeral. He did not move. He did not shout. He only watched. And when the young guard took Marta's elbow a second time, sharper, the old man's knuckles went white around the can. Inside the lobby, in the shadow of a potted palm that nobody watered, a junior assistant named Toby Chen watched through the glass. Toby was 24. He had been in the movie business for 11 months and 3 days, and he had already learned the first rule of the movie business, which is that you do not make a scene. He was holding a tablet and a paper list, the paper list, the original, the one with the printer's time stamp in the corner, and he had just made a discovery his mouth was too young to know what to do with. On the digital list, scrolling on the guard's tablet, there was no Calloway. On the paper list, the original list Toby had printed himself at 6:15 that evening and carried through the lobby for 45 minutes, Marta Calloway was there. Written neatly in capital letters in the VIP guest section, with a seat number and a dinner number and the letters KR, Keanu's guest, penciled beside her name like a private joke between friends. And then over it, struck through from top right to bottom left in ballpoint pen, hard enough to tear the paper Marta Calloway. Crossed out. Not by accident. The pen had gone through the paper. Somebody had been angry, or somebody had been afraid. And either way somebody had made a decision about a woman they had never met, 20 minutes before she reached the gate. Toby Chen looked at the tablet. He looked at the paper. He looked at the printer's stamp, 1842. It was 7:03 now. Marta Calloway had been standing at the barrier for exactly 1 minute, and 21 minutes before that somebody had written her out of the night. The question was never whether she belonged there. The question was who was afraid of a 68-year-old woman with a ticket stub in her purse. Keep that question somewhere safe. You're going to need it. Inside the Signora, past the lobby, past the champagne table and the velvet rope and the wall of photographers, Keanu Reeves stood in the corner of the green room that had until recently been the coat check because he had asked to stand there. He was doing what he did at every premiere. Nothing. The movie was the thing. He had said it so many times that people had stopped believing it was a joke, which was fine with him. He stood with his hands in his pockets, a black jacket over a white shirt, 62 years old and looking like a man who had once been a boy and had never quite gotten over it. His publicist, a tired woman named Lynn Wexler who had spent 15 years being paid very well to explain that her client was not, in fact, joking, was talking at him. 3 minutes, Keanu, 2 minutes at the wall. Marcus and Sarai are out front already. The governor's daughter is here. Could we? Where's Marta? Lynn stopped. What? My guest, Marta Calloway, she should be at the wall. Tall, gray hair, the dress. He stopped, because he had never asked about the dress and he had never needed to. Elderly, graceful, small. You'll know her because she looks like she's listening to something the rest of us can't hear. Lynn Wexler had been in this business long enough to know a problem when it walked in wearing a nice suit. You have a guest. I have a guest. On the list. MMM. He was already moving because he had heard something, a change in the pitch of the night outside, a small wrong note in the music of the evening, the way you hear a cough in a silent theater. He walked through the lobby past Toby Chen, who was standing frozen behind the potted palm with a paper list in his hand. And Toby said the bravest thing he ever said. Toby said quietly to Keanu Reeves's back. She was on the list. The original list. Keanu stopped. He turned. He looked at Toby, and Toby watched the man take the paper from his hand, watched his eyes move down the column, watched them land, watched them stop. Then Keanu Reeves folded the list along the crease, tucked it into his jacket, and walked toward the doors. He did it the way he moved in movies, unhurried, unstoppable, a man doing a small thing with his whole life behind it. The doors opened. The flash wall ignited, white and white and white, a sound like weather, and the voices rose like a wave, and the woman in silver turned, and Marcus Bell turned, and every camera in Los Angeles turned. And Keanu Reeves walked past every microphone, past every interviewer holding out a hand like a bridge, past the velvet rope, past the barrier itself. Stepped over it, actually, the way you step over a hose in a driveway, and stopped in front of the public side of the fence, where a woman in a church sale dress stood with her chin up and her purse held against her chest. Keanu Reeves said, "Marta." And here was the thing every photographer caught, and the thing the caption writers would spend the next 3 days failing to explain. The woman in the church sale dress looked up at the most famous face in the building, and she did not smile. She did not cry. She just looked at him, 40 years worth of looking packed into 1 second, and she said, very quietly, very calmly, "I told you not to make a fuss." "Marta, what happened?" "Nothing, we'll talk later. Go do your movie." "Who moved you off the list?" She did not answer. She did that tiny thing with her mouth that meant, "I am not going to trouble you with this." A thing she had done, he realized, for the entire time he had known her, which is to say, his entire adult life. And there was a sound behind them, a polite manufactured laugh, and there was Garrett Voss. Garrett Voss was 52 years old, the CEO of Meridian Pictures, tan in a way that suggested he paid a man to achieve it, dressed like a man who had never once in his life carried his own luggage. He did not walk, he arranged himself. He arrived at Keanu's shoulder with a smile that had been calibrated in a boardroom and said, in the voice he used for cameras, "Keanu, everything all right, my friend?" "She was on my list, Garrett." Garrett's smile did not so much as flicker. It was a magnificent smile. It had survived takeover bids. "Was she? Let me check that for you right now." He turned not to Marta, never to Marta, as if she were weather, and made a small gesture to the security team, a gesture that said handle it, a gesture that had handled 1,000 things. Dale Kessler stepped forward. It was clearly against everything in him. You could watch him decide. But a man with 22 years of quiet in his ears does what the gesture tells him, and he took Keanu Reeves by the arm, the left arm, above the elbow, not hard, and he said, in a low voice meant to be the last word, "Mr. Reeves, the schedule, please. We'll get this sorted, but let her go. Mr. Reeves, you let her go, and you can take me anywhere you want, but nobody touches her again tonight." And the second guard, the young one, the one whose face had never been surprised by anything, made the mistake. He took Marta's arm again, sharp, possessive, the way you take a package. Time did not stop. It would be tempting to say it did, but it didn't. What happened was that it slowed, the way it slows at the bottom of a pool. And what happened was that every camera in Los Angeles turned, not on Keanu Reeves, but on the two men holding, one of them, the most famous actor in the building, and the other, a woman in a church sale dress with 40 years of patience in her purse. And then Garrett Voss made a decision he would replay later, on a couch in a house he could barely afford to keep, like a man touching a bruise. He said the words, "Remove him." 2 more guards materialized, coming off the rope line behind him like a trick. They took Keanu Reeves' both arms professionally, with the terrible efficiency of men who had done this before and hated it just enough, and they began to walk him, backward off his own red carpet, toward the doors of his own premiere. The gasps were a wave. The flash units went insane, a sound like rain on a tin roof. And the woman in silver, Sarai Whitfield, the name would come back to Marta later, stopped mid-pose, her publicist still talking into her ear, and Sarai Whitfield did a strange thing. She did not turn away. She did not raise a hand to the cameras. She simply stepped off the carpet, one step off the red onto the sidewalk, as casually as a woman stepping off a curb at a bus stop. Marcus Bell looked at her, then he stepped off too. Then a third actor, a kid nobody knew yet in glasses, who had been standing at the edge of the carpet for 40 minutes hoping somebody would photograph him. He stepped off the carpet too, and nobody photographed him, but he did it anyway, and later everyone would say that was the moment they knew what kind of man he was. And then the strange math of the evening happened. One by one in silence with no word spoken, no signal given, no plan, the way a flock turns, the stars of the premiere walked off the carpet. Not toward the doors, toward the barrier, toward the commotion, toward the two guards still holding the arms of a man who had asked them, not ordered them to let an old woman stand where she had been invited to stand. There were 24 of them now, then 3 dozen. The carpet emptied from the edges inward, the way a field empties of light. And they stood. Nobody said anything. They just stood between the guards and Marta, between the machine and the woman, and the silence was the loudest thing that had ever happened on that block. The young guard let go of Marta's arm like it was hot. Dale Kessler let go of Keanu Reeves. Garrett Voss's smile, for the first time in 20 years, had nowhere to go. It sat on his face like a hat on a table. And across the street, the old man in the flat cap lowered the film can, looked at Garrett Voss with a kind of terrible patience, and his mouth moved, and if anybody had been able to read lips they would have seen him say, to no one, to everyone. He promised. Nobody understood what they were watching, least of all the man who had written her name out of the night, because the woman in the church sale dress was holding something in her fist, behind her purse, all through it something that would have changed everything if anyone had thought to look. A ticket stub. Movie stub 1986, faded, and on the back in pencil in a young man's handwriting, the pencil soft and gray with 40 years, I owe you one premiere, front row. She had kept it like a woman keeps water in a desert. The guards retreated. The carpet hesitantly began to fill again. Keanu Reeves turned to Marta Calloway, and in front of every camera in Los Angeles he took her hand and said, in a voice that carried exactly as far as it needed to, "You're with me, Marta. Front row. I promised you front row." And they walked in through the doors of the Signora, a 68-year-old woman in a church sale dress and the most famous man in the building, and the doors closed behind them, and the night outside went back to being a night outside. Which was exactly when the real night began. Because the young guard, the one with the face that had never been surprised, stood at the barrier with his hands shaking, and he said to Dale Kessler in a voice nobody heard, "The list. The digital list. Somebody changed it on the server 20 minutes ago. I watched it change. The name just vanished." And Dale Kessler, who had been about to say something kind about his mother, went very still, and he asked the question that would carry him through the next 3 days like a splinter under the skin. Who has access to the server? The young guard laughed, a dry little sound with nothing funny in it. Everybody, Dale. That's the business. The only person who doesn't have access to the server is the woman who was on the list. Somewhere in the building, a phone began to ring. Nobody answered it. The lobby of the Signora was a machine of light and noise, champagne flutes passing like batons, publicists steering clients past each other with the polite ferocity of air traffic controllers, and Marta June Calloway walked through the middle of it holding Keanu Reeves's arm and feeling like a woman who had stepped into a photograph of a world that didn't exist anymore. He had not let go of her hand since the barrier. She had tried twice to take it back, and he had simply kept it, not in a showy way, not the way a movie star holds a prop, the way a grandson holds his grandmother at a crowded crosswalk. It was the same hand he had used 40 years ago to tear tickets at her theater door. "Row A," Keanu said to the usher, a young man with a face full of nerves who kept glancing at Keanu and then at the old woman and then at the ceiling, as if to check the roof hadn't caved in. Seats 3 and 4, and the seat next to her needs to stay empty. It belongs to nobody. Yes, sir, of course, sir. They walked down the aisle. The theater was enormous, a cathedral of red velvet and gold trim, the kind of room that made you lower your voice, and Marta lowered hers, and then she stopped lowering it because her voice was gone. Keanu pulled out her chair, seat 3, row a dead center 9 feet from the screen, and she sat down in it, and she looked up at the screen. And for a second she was somewhere else entirely, a smaller screen, a colder room, a line of folding chairs, an audience of 41 people on a Tuesday night in 1986, and a man in a suit standing at the front with his hands in his pockets, saying quiet, hold still. This is the good part. Okay, Keanu said. Fine, Marta said. Her voice was a little high. Fine, it's a lovely room. It's a preview theater. It seats 800. Oh. Everything all right, Marta? She stopped. She turned to him, and for the first time all night she looked old, in the way you look old when a thing you wanted your whole life finally arrives, and it's heavier than you remembered. I wore my grandmother's dress to see your movie, she said, and I ruined your premiere. You didn't ruin it. He said it flat the way he said most things so that you believed him. You made it. Sit. Watch. I'll be back after the wall. Do your cameras, she said, settling into the seat, taking a breath so deep the velvet drank it. I've got a good seat. I promised you front row, he said. I keep my promises. And he said it like a man saying a prayer he'd said every day for 40 years. And he walked away toward the lights, and Marta watched him go. And she thought about the boy who had torn tickets at $4 an hour, and the envelope he used to slide under her office door. And the night he had stood in front of her desk, 18 years old, hands shaking, saying, I can't do the night shift next month. I have to go home, my sister's sick. And she had said, then bring her here, and he had said, she can't walk. And Marta had said, then I'll come to her. And she had gone, every Tuesday for 9 months, to a small apartment in Van Nuys, with soup she made in the theater's little kitchen, because a boy who was carrying the whole world on his shoulders needed somebody to carry the pot. The lights went down. The film began. And Marta June Calloway, 68 years old, in a grandmother's dress in a velvet palace in Los Angeles, watched the title card come up on the screen, big letters, silver on black, and her hands went cold on her lap, because the words on the screen were not the words she expected. The Long Way Home. Not the new title, the old one, the 1986 one. Her husband's title, Joe's title, the title of the only film he ever made, the film that had killed him a little every day for 4 years after it disappeared, the film that the whole world had long ago agreed had been lost, a curiosity, a footnote, a thing people wrote about in film magazines with a kind of sadness, the way you write about a famous ship that went down. They had remade it. Meridian had remade Joe Calloway's lost film, and they hadn't even changed the title, and nobody had thought to tell her, and nobody had thought she would ever know. Beside her, seat 4, the seat that belonged to nobody, sat a woman. No, it was empty. It was empty, and it stayed empty, and Marta sat very still in the dark, and the film unspooled in front of her, a young man walking down a road at dawn, and she thought, Joe, they took it. They took it and they gave it to somebody else, and they didn't even change the name. And then she thought, no, Joe, listen to me. Tonight is not about that. Tonight is about a promise. And she put her hand over her purse, over the stub inside it, and she made herself watch. After the screening in the lobby, the champagne came back, and the voices came back, and the flash units came back, and Marta stood against a wall with a glass of water she wasn't drinking, waiting for Keanu to finish being famous so she could say goodnight and walk home through the city she no longer recognized. And then a woman in silver appeared in front of her, Sarai Whitfield, the woman from the carpet, the one who had stepped off the red into the sidewalk like a woman off a curb. Sarai Whitfield was 48 years old. She had been famous for 3 decades. She looked at Marta with her mouth slightly open, the way you look at a person you've been looking for. Mrs. Calloway. Marta blinked. I'm sorry, do I know you? My name is Sarai Whitfield. She said it with a strange little laugh, her eyes bright. You knew me when I was 9. I had pigtails. I was in your theater on Tuesdays. I was the girl who couldn't sit still. Marta's glass stopped halfway to her mouth. She stared at the woman, the cheekbones, the long neck, the way she held her shoulders, and then the way you find a face in an old photograph. She found it. Sarai, she said. Sarah Bate. Nobody's called me Sarah Bate since 1986. Sarai's voice wobbled. I never forgot your kitchen, the soup, the way you'd let us stay after the screening and sweep the aisles as payment. The night you told me, do you remember what you told me? Marta remembered. She remembered everything. I told you, she said slowly, that you were going to be somebody, and that somebody has a responsibility to the people she sweeps the aisles with. Sarai Whitfield, one of the most decorated actresses of her generation, stood in the lobby of the Signora with tears running down her face, not caring, not dabbing, not even noticing. I found you, she said. They told me you'd be here tonight and I didn't believe it and she stopped. I stepped off the carpet. I didn't know it was you until I saw your face, and then I knew, and I couldn't, Mrs. Calloway. I stepped off the carpet. I saw you, Marta said gently. It was a beautiful thing to watch. From the balcony, Garrett Voss watched the two women, the fatting star and the woman in the grandmother's dress, and his smile, the magnificent boardroom smile, was gone. Behind him, his chief operating officer, a flat-eyed man named Paul Rayner, spoke into his ear in a voice that had never once carried a note of surprise. Sir, she didn't come with anything. Purse, a ticket stub, $41 cash, that's it. Then who was the old man across the street? Lester Brine, retired projectionist, worked at the Calloway's Theater from 1964 until it closed. 61 years, sir. Garrett Voss said nothing. And sir, Rayner paused, the pause of a man about to say something he knows will land. The film they screened tonight, the remake, our remake, it's based on the 1986 picture, the one he did not finish. Garrett Voss turned from the balcony, and his face was not the face of a man in a boardroom. It was the face of a man who had just seen his own name carved into a headstone. Find out what he was carrying, he said. Find out where it's been for 40 years, and find out if anyone else knows. Sir. The name on the list, Garrett said. The Calloway woman who put her on it. The star's office, Rayner said. Direct, personal. The old man's assistant typed it himself. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, watching the woman in the grandmother's dress laugh with Sarai Whitfield at the bottom of the stairs. Then he said, softly, like a man touching a bruise, then she's been in his life this whole time, and we never knew. He looked at Rayner. This is the last night of the Echo Park Theater, Paul. Tomorrow is her last full day. The hearing is Friday. That's enough time. Whatever she has, whatever that man is carrying, we find it, and we burn it before she can show the world what her husband made. Keanu walked Marta home that night. Not in a car, on foot, through the streets of Echo Park, past the taco stand that had been there since before either of them was born, past the mural of a woman with a crown of flowers, past the barber shop where the old men still played dominoes on the sidewalk on Tuesday nights, and Marta kept looking at him out of the corner of her eye, because the man beside her walked exactly the way the boy had walked, hands in pockets, head down, listening with his whole body. You don't have to do this, she said for the 6th time. I know, he said, I want to. I live 5 blocks from the Signora. I am not a fragile thing, Keanu. I know that too, he glanced at her. I've known it for 40 years. You fed me, you paid my sister's doctor, you never once asked me to thank you. He stopped walking. He took something out of his pocket, a wallet, old leather, and from the wallet, folded once, soft as cloth, a ticket stub. I kept mine, he said. Marta looked at it. 1986. The Cine Echo Park. The Long Way Home, one showing only March 14. and on the back in her own handwriting, the pencil barely there after all these years, front row, "The day you make your movie, I'll be there. M." She took it in her fingers like it was made of glass. "You kept it." "I kept it," he said. "You kept yours." "I kept mine." They stood outside the Echo Park Theater, under the dark marquee that still said "Final Week," and Marta looked up at the letters that had been her life, and the tears she had held all night finally came. Not the dramatic kind, just the tired kind, the kind that leak out of you after a long day of being brave. "I never blamed you for it," she said without turning around. "The remake, I want you to know that. They told me tonight, Sarai told me, Meridian bought the rights years ago, before you were ever involved. You didn't know." "I didn't know," he said. "I'm sorry if I'd known what it was." "What would you have done? Refused a studio's biggest picture because the title belonged to a dead projectionist's wife in Echo Park?" She smiled at the marquee. "You'd have done it, wouldn't you? You absolutely would have done it." "Marta." "I'm not angry. Joe wouldn't be angry either." She said the name carefully, the way you touch something that's been in the freezer a long time. "He'd be angry they changed the ending." There was a sound behind them, an old door opening. Both of them turned. In the doorway of the theater's side alley, in the light of a single naked bulb, stood the old man in the flat cap. He was holding the film can against his chest, and his eyes were on Keanu, not on the movie star, on the boy, the ticket boy, the one who had swept the aisles with Sarah Bate on Tuesday nights. "Evening, Keanu," the old man said. His voice was a bass with 50 years of wear on it. "You look good for a man who used to run my projector." "Mr. Brine," Keanu's voice went soft with something like grief. "You're still here. Somebody has to watch the building." Lester Brine came out of the alley, and he was old, older than Marta, older than the theater, almost 81 years old, with hands that had threaded film in the dark for half a century. He looked at the can in his arms, and then he looked at Marta, and his face did something complicated, the face of a man carrying a secret for so long that the secret had grown into his bones. "Marta," he said, "I need to show you something, both of you, come inside." The theater, dark, smelled the way theaters smell when they're dying dust and old velvet and the ghost of popcorn butter. Lester led them down the center aisle, flipping on lights one at a time, and each light showed more of the same: the worn seats, the patched carpet, the screen with its small tear in the upper right corner that Joe had always planned to fix. Lester stopped at the front at the old projection booth ladder, and he set the can down on the stage, and he did not open it yet. He just stood there, a small man, 81, in a flat cap, in the dark of a theater he had kept alive with his hands for 61 years. 40 years ago, he said, "You want to know what really happened to your husband's film?" Marta's blood went very quiet. "They burned it," she said. "The vault fire, they told us." "They told you the negative burned in a vault fire." Lester took off his cap. He held it in both hands the way you hold a hat at a funeral. "Marta, I need you to sit down." "I'm sitting," she whispered. She wasn't. Keanu took her arm gently and lowered her into seat 5, row C, her seat, the one she always sat in. "I was on duty that night," Lester said. "April 4th, 1986. The negative was stored at Meridian's vault in Burbank. Joe signed a distribution deal 2 weeks earlier. Did you know that? He signed it against my advice. He believed them because they promised the film would open wide, and he believed in the film, and he believed in people." Lester's voice caught. 2 weeks later, the vault burned. They said a faulty water heater. They said the negative is gone, the film is gone. Your husband's life's work is gone, our condolences. Here's a check for $12,000. Sign this release. "I remember the check," Marta said. "I remember burning it." "I know you did. I held the ladder when you painted the marquee black the day after the funeral." He paused. "But Marta, I was there that night. I'd gone to the vault myself against the rules to pick up a print we'd lent the studio for a preview screening. I parked across the street and I watched 2 men go in through the loading bay at 1:40 in the morning, and at 2:10 they came out carrying reels, 4 of them, 2 trips. and at 3:04 the vault was on fire. The word hung in the silence of the theater like smoke. "They didn't burn the negative, Marta," Lester said. "They stole it. The fire was for the insurance and for the story. They needed the world to believe Joe's film was gone because the film was dangerous to them and Joe had refused to sell them this building. And the men who ran that studio then, the man, I should say. It was one man, a man named Harold Voss. He wanted this lot more than he wanted anything, and Joe's little picture was standing between him and it." "How do you know?" Keanu's voice was barely there. "Because when I walked into the vault the next morning before they sealed it, I found something they missed." Lester bent and opened the can, very slowly, the way you open a door you've been afraid to open for 40 years. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, wound on a steel reel, the film gleamed darkly under the naked bulb. The print they lent us for the preview. The only print of the long way home left in the world. They took the negative and 9 answer prints, but they forgot the preview print because it was checked out. It wasn't in the system. He touched it almost reverently. "I took it. I put it in a cookie tin. I put the tin in my garage. And I have waited 40 years, Marta, for the night you'd be strong enough to watch it, and for the night the man who did this to you would be standing somewhere he could see it fall." Marta Calloway sat in her seat, row C, seat 5 in her dead building, and she looked at her husband's film, the only one, the one the world was told had burned, and she did not cry. She was past crying. She was in a place beyond it, where the grief was so old it had become a kind of fuel. "Why now?" she said. "Why not when Joe was alive? Why did you let him die thinking he'd failed?" Lester's face broke. It was the face of a man who had carried this question for 4 decades and had rehearsed the answer 1,000 times and still didn't have it. "Because Harold Voss came to me the week after the fire, Marta. He knew. He knew I'd been there that night. He sat in this theater in this seat, and he told me that if I ever said a word about what I'd seen, if I ever produced that print, he would make sure you and Joe lost this building, and your home, and he would bury your name so deep that no theater in the country would hire you. And I believed him because I'd watched him burn a man's life's work and smile about it. So I kept quiet, and I watched Joe die believing he wasn't good enough, and I have lived with that every day since, Marta. Every single day." The silence in the theater was enormous, and then Marta said very quietly, "He's dead now. Harold Voss is dead, has been for 20 years. "Yes," Lester said. "He died in 2006, and his son took his company." He looked at Keanu, and his eyes were old and clear. "His son is sitting in the Signora tonight at the premiere of a film he stole from your husband in every way but the title. His name is Garrett Voss, and he doesn't know I have this." He put his hand on the can. "But he's looking for it. He's been looking for it his whole life, because his father bled on his deathbed about a fire in Burbank, and Garrett has spent 20 years terrified of the day this film would crawl out of the ground. He buried it in." Keanu stood very still in the dark, and then he said slowly, like a man reading his own name on a stone, "They remade it. Tonight. Meridian remade Joe's film, and they didn't change the title." He looked at the can. "And now I know why they've spent 40 years making sure nobody ever saw the original." "Because the original is better, Keanu." Lester's voice was soft. "It's a masterpiece. It was always a masterpiece. And they know they've always known that the day one human being sees this print, the remake is finished, the lie is finished, and Meridian is finished." He picked up the can and held it out, not to Marta, to Keanu. "You're the only one they can't touch," he said. "You're the only one with the money and the name to stand in front of a camera and show this to the world. Marta can't. They'll crush her. They'll call her a liar and a lunatic and bury her under legal fees till there's nothing left. But you they can't bury, no matter how hard they try." Keanu looked at the can for a long moment. And then he looked past it, at Marta, at the woman who had fed him soup and paid his sister's doctor, and given him a job when he was a boy nobody else would hire. And he saw her sitting in her seat in her dying theater, holding her 40-year-old stub like a woman holding a candle in a wind. "Mr. Brine," he said, "I'm going to need a projector." The morning after the premiere, the world had already rearranged itself into before and after. The video, shot on a dying phone by a kid nobody knew, a kid in glasses named Ryan Ortiz who had been standing at the edge of the carpet for 40 minutes hoping somebody would photograph him, had been up for 9 hours, and it had done what videos do in the new world. It had eaten the country. 18 million views, 60,000 comments. The Tonight shows were arguing about it. The morning shows were arguing about it. The comments were a civil war. Half of America furious at security, half of America furious that half of America was furious, and underneath it all one image, looped a million times. A 68-year-old woman in a church sale dress, chin up, being walked backward off a red carpet by 2 men in black. And the other image, the one that undid people, Keanu Reeves stepping over the barrier like it was a garden hose. Marta did not see any of it. Marta was at the county office building at 8:30 that morning, in the fluorescent silence of the 5th floor, signing a form that told the city of Los Angeles that she understood that her building would be demolished at 7:00 a.m. Monday, and that she had no legal claim to stop it, and that she accepted the terms, and that she was a citizen of sound mind. She signed her name, Marta June Calloway, in the same hand she had used to write Front Row, the day you make your movie on a ticket stub 40 years before, and the clerk behind the glass pushed a yellow copy across the counter at her, and Marta took it, folded it into her purse, and went outside into the sun with the form pressed against her ribs. The truth of the money, the theater was not just dying of age, it was dying of arithmetic. In 2008, when the world came apart, Marta had done what 1,000 small business owners did. She had mortgaged the building to the hilt to keep the doors open, because the theater was the only thing the neighborhood had, and the neighborhood had kids, and the kids needed somewhere to land. The mortgage had been sold twice, then a third time, and by 2019 it sat in the portfolio of a holding company called Halcyon Capital. And Halcyon Capital was one of 9 shell companies, and the shell companies all answered to one address in Century City, and the address was the headquarters of a studio whose name nobody said out loud in the hearing that morning, but everybody knew. Meridian had bought the lot in February, not the theater, the lot. The building was worth nothing to them. The land was worth everything, a full city block, 5 minutes from downtown, zoned for mixed-use development with a view of the lake. The plan, printed and bound and circulated in a boardroom nobody would ever see, called for a glass tower, 40 stories, with a rooftop restaurant named Vista and a leasing office on the ground floor. The demolition was scheduled for Monday because the contract said Monday. The contract said Monday because the option on the property, signed by Joe Calloway's own hand in 1986, said that Meridian held the right to purchase the lot at market value, and that the right was exercisable at any time, and that it survived Joe's death, and that it bound his heirs, and that it was, and here was the sentence the lawyers underlined, not subject to renegotiation. Joe had signed it in the wake of the distribution deal when he was still believing, when he was still the kind of man who signed what he was told to sign because he believed people. He had signed it 2 weeks before the fire. Harold Voss had never exercised the option, he died holding it. And his son, Garrett Voss, had found it in 2006 in a father's file under a tab that said simply, Theater. And he had held it for 20 years, waiting for the land to be worth more than the trouble of taking it. The trouble, as of this morning, was Marta June Calloway. At 11:00 a.m., Marta was back at the theater alone, doing what she had done every morning for 48 years, sweeping the aisles. The broom was older than some of her regulars. She swept row F, row G, row H, and she did not cry because she had done all her crying in the dark the night before, alone in her seat, with her husband's film sleeping in a can on the stage and a movie star asleep in her guest room, because Keanu Reeves had refused to leave Echo Park, and she had given him the room that used to be Joe's office, and she had heard him at 2:00 in the morning talking quietly on the phone about a projector. The phone rang at 11:12. It was the bank. The bank was sorry. The bank had called to tell her that the mortgagor Halcyon Capital had initiated a foreclosure proceeding under the terms of the 2008 instrument, and that there would be a hearing and that she should seek counsel. Marta said thank you, and the bank said it was sorry, and Marta hung up, and she swept row H again, because it was better than screaming. At 11:47, Sarai Whitfield's car pulled up outside. Sarai came in through the front doors the way she had come in through them as a 9-year-old with pigtails, without knocking, and she stood in the aisle watching Marta sweep, and then she said, "You're not going to fight them." Marta kept sweeping. "Fighting costs money, Sarah bait." "Fighting costs money," Sarai agreed. She set her purse down on the armrest of row F and took out her checkbook, a real checkbook, the kind nobody carries anymore, and she wrote a number on it and she tore it out and she held it out to Marta. "That's for the lawyers. No conditions, no publicity. You don't have to thank me. You don't even have to accept it." She paused. "But I need you to know that I've been famous for 30 years. And there was exactly one place in my whole childhood where I was famous for being me, and it was this theater. And I'm not going to let them knock it down while I'm standing here with a checkbook in my hands." Marta looked at the check. She looked at the number. It was more money than the theater had made in the last 10 years. "Sit down, Sarah bait," Marta said gently. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it all the way through." She leaned the broom against the wall and sat down in row F, and Sarai sat down beside her, and the theater was dark around them, and Marta said, "I'm not going to fight them with money because they have more money than God and they'll drag it out until I'm dead. I'm going to fight them with something they can't outspend." She looked at the screen. "Do you remember what the film was about?" "Of course I remember," Sarai said. "It's the only thing I've ever done that I'm proud of. It's about a father who comes home from the war and finds the town he left doesn't want him anymore. The land's been sold. The houses are gone. The people he loved have moved on, and he spends the whole movie walking the road home. And at the end," she stopped. "At the end, he sits down on the porch of the house that isn't there anymore and he waits for his wife to come out. And the audience never sees if she comes, because the film ends with him sitting there. Joe said it's the longest walk in the world, coming home to a place that doesn't want you, and the only way through it is to keep walking." "He changed the ending in the remake," Marta said quietly. "Keanu told me. In the remake the wife comes out, the family is reunited, it's a happy ending, and the test audiences liked it better that way, so Meridian shot it twice and kept the happy one." She looked at Sarai. "Do you know why Joe ended it the way he did?" "Because it's true." "Because it's true," Marta said, "and because he believed that the audience is smart enough to walk the last few steps themselves. He used to say the best ending is the one the viewer finishes in their own heart." She looked down at her hands. "They didn't change that title, Sarah bait. They changed the ending. And tomorrow night in this theater, one last time, the way it was meant to be seen, I'm going to show Joe's film to everybody who stood up for me on that carpet. And I'm going to let them walk the last few steps themselves." Sarai Whitfield looked at her, and the check was still in her hand, and she looked at it, and then, slowly, deliberately, like a woman putting down a weapon, she put the check back in her purse, unclipped. "Then I'll bring the people," she said. "Every actor who stepped off that carpet, I'll bring them all." "Good," Marta said, "and you'll bring one more." She looked toward the door where the sunlight was, where the street was, where the city was, where the man who had crossed her name off a list was, this morning in his glass tower above the city, looking down at a block of land he thought he owned. "Bring somebody to film it." The phone rang again at 12:31. Marta answered it in the office, and it was a man from something called the Jansen Group, and the man's voice was smooth as milk. And he said he represented a private charitable foundation that had heard about her difficulties, and that the foundation was prepared to pay off the mortgage in full, and to provide a restoration fund, and to establish an endowment for the theater's operation. And he said the word preservation twice, and he said no strings, and Marta Calloway, who had believed things all her life, believed him. "Who's the foundation?" she said. We prefer to remain anonymous, Mrs. Calloway. The donor wishes for the gift to be a pure act of goodwill. You understand?" "Yes," Marta said. "Yes, of course, I understand." "When would you like us to move forward?" "Now," Marta said. "Please, Monday is demolition day." "Then we'll move now." The man's voice was warm. "Congratulations, Mrs. Calloway, you've saved your theater." Marta hung up the phone, and she sat in Joe's old chair in the little office with the posters on the walls, and she put her head down on the desk, and she cried the way you cry when the weight of decades finally lifts, and the tears ran down into the wood grain of the desk where Joe's elbows had rested for 20 years, and she said, out loud, to the empty office, to the ghost of her husband, to the boy who had torn tickets at her door, "We did it, Joe. We saved it." Outside the theater, 3 blocks away, a clean black SUV sat under a jacaranda tree with its engine running, and in the passenger seat, a flat-eyed man named Paul Rayner watched the theater's front door through a pair of field glasses, and he spoke into a phone and he said, "She took it. The Jansen Group wire hits her bank at 4. Get the covenant attached, and have the wingman team on standby for Monday, because here's the thing about a foundation that doesn't exist, sir." He paused, and his voice carried the smallest note of pleasure. "It can change its mind." The Jansen Group moved fast, the way money moves when it has somewhere to be. By 4:00 that afternoon, the mortgage on the Echo Park Theater had been paid in full. By 4:47, Marta had a confirmation email from the bank, in the flat language of banking, which is the language of things already done. By 6:00, Sarai Whitfield had made 42 calls, and by 9:00 that night, the word had gone out through the industry the way water finds the cracks. There is a screening at the Echo Park Theater on Sunday night, one night before the demolition, of a film the world was told burned in 1986, and the woman who ran the theater is the one showing it, and the man who brought the projector is Keanu Reeves. The machine of the industry, which runs on fear and favors, did what it does. It said yes. By Friday morning, the list for Sunday night had grown its own gravity. Sarai had called in every marker she had, and she had markers everywhere. Actors, directors, writers, 2 executives from a rival studio who had been waiting their whole careers for something to use against Meridian, a documentary filmmaker with a camera crew, and an insatiable appetite for the truth, 3 retired projectionists who wanted to stand beside Lester Brine and run the film the way it was meant to be run. And because Sarai had told the story to exactly one person, who had told it to exactly one person, who ran a website with 40 million readers, a press corps that showed up Friday morning on the sidewalk, outside the theater like weather arriving. And the whole time Marta swept. She swept row A through row Z, she dusted the poster frames. The Long Way Home, 1986, the only run, one night only, March 14, and she polished the brass rail at the ticket window, and she hung the marquee's letters fresh for what she told the neighborhood would be the last time. Tonight, one show only. She did not change it to Sunday, because she liked the way it looked, and because after Monday there would be no marquee at all, and she wanted to leave it saying the truest thing it had ever said. On Friday at noon, the man from the Jansen Group called again. The same warm voice, milk smooth, delighted. "Mrs. Calloway, wonderful news. The board has approved a restoration fund. We'd like to wire the first installment today." That's very kind." Marta sat in the office, the phone warm against her ear, the afternoon sun falling across Joe's desk. "I don't know how to thank you." "Thank us by taking care of yourself," the man said, and it was so warm, so exactly what a woman who had been alone for 40 years needed to hear, that Marta felt her eyes sting. "We'll messenger over the final agreement for your signature. It's just the standard gift acknowledgement, a few pages. Our lawyer is standing by, he'll walk you through every line." The lawyer. Marta's voice sharpened just slightly, the instinct of a woman who had signed too many things with a pen she couldn't get back. "I thought you said no strings." "No strings," the man laughed. It's a gift acknowledgement, Mrs. Calloway. IRS requirements. We can't hand you $3 million without a paper trail or the foundation loses its exemption." He paused. "And quite frankly, our lawyer wants to meet you. He grew up in Echo Park. You're the only thing he remembers fondly about the neighborhood." Marta laughed. She couldn't help it. After 3 days of lawyers and banks and demolition orders, the idea that a lawyer had grown up in Echo Park and remembered her theater fondly, it was a small kindness, and she took it because she had been hungry for small kindnesses for a very long time. "Fine," she said. "Send him over. I'll make coffee." In the meantime, 3 blocks away, the clean black SUV sat under the jacaranda tree, and Paul Rayner watched the theater through field glasses, and he spoke into his phone, and what he said was, "The gift acknowledgement is page 1 of the demolition consent. She'll sign it the way she signed everything Joe handed her without reading the last page. And the last page says the lot reverts to Halcyon if the structure is not raised by Monday. The woman thinks she just won. Let her have the weekend. It makes Monday clean." At 2:00 that afternoon, a man named Marcus Dell arrived at the theater carrying a leather portfolio and a box of donuts, which he set on the counter of the ticket booth like an offering. Marcus Dell was 51 years old, wore glasses made for a face that smiled a lot, and looked at Marta Calloway with the particular tenderness of a man fulfilling a debt he had owed his whole life. He had grown up in Echo Park. He had watched the Saturday matinees through the gap in the emergency exit door, because his family couldn't afford tickets, and Marta had caught him once, and she had not thrown him out. She had let him sweep the aisles in payment, the way she did with all the kids who couldn't pay, and she had kept doing it even after his mother found out and told him to never accept charity. And Marta had said, "It isn't charity, he's on the payroll," and she had given him a dime and an official title. Assistant floor manager. "You haven't changed," Marcus Dell said, standing in the office with his portfolio against his chest, looking at her the way you look at a portrait of someone you loved. "I mean that. You haven't changed at all." "Flattery'll get you a cup of coffee," Marta said, and she poured him one, and they sat in the office with the afternoon sun going long and gold across the desk, and Marcus Dell opened his portfolio and he walked her through the gift acknowledgement line by line. Page 1, donor intent. Page 2, acknowledgement of receipt. Page 3, tax language. Page 4, the restoration fund. Page 5, Marcus Dell turned the page and his glasses caught the light and he said in his warm, easy voice, "And page 5 is the boilerplate release, standard for restricted endowments. You're agreeing that the foundation's obligations are limited to the amounts listed and that no oral promises are binding. Just initial here and sign at the bottom." He slid a pen across the desk. "You already know what it says, effectively. Your signature, the date, and we're done." Marta looked at the page. She did not read it. She had been doing this for 48 years, signing receipts, signing orders, signing the 100 small papers that kept a business alive, and her hand knew the shape of the pen the way it knew the shape of a broom. She signed her name, Marta June Calloway, and she initialed where she was told to initial, and she pushed the portfolio back across the desk, and Marcus Dell closed it, and his smile was warm as milk, and he said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Calloway. The Restoration Fund wires Monday morning." Monday morning. Marta's heart did a small, foolish thing. That's the day it was supposed to come down. "I know," Marcus Dell said, and he stood and he took the portfolio and he paused at the door and he looked back at her with an expression that would have been readable in another life, in another story. The look of a man handing a woman flowers he knows are poisoned. "You saved it," he said. "You actually saved it." Marta made him take the donuts. She was still glowing an hour later when Keanu came in through the back door, dusty from a morning of hauling projector parts out of Lester's garage, and he found her in the office humming, actually humming, an old song from the 50s. One Joe used to whistle, and he stopped in the doorway, and something in him tightened, the way it tightens when you see a person at the edge of a cliff having a wonderful time. "Marta," he said, "what's the Jansen Group?" "Keany?" She used his old name, the name only she and Lester used, the name from the ticket booth days. It's a foundation. They paid off the mortgage, and there's a restoration fund coming Monday. She beamed at him. We saved it. We actually saved it. Keanu stood very still in the doorway in the dust and the dying light, and he said slowly, "Who told you about the Jansen Group?" "A man called me," Marta said. "Tuesday, the day after the premiere. They'd heard about what happened. They reached out." Keanu's face did something she had never seen on it before, a kind of careful blankness, the face of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking the sum. "Marta, can I see the paperwork, the gift acknowledgement?" "It's all official," she said, a little hurt, a little defensive, the way you get when someone questions the good news you've been holding like a candle. "There's a lawyer involved and everything. He grew up in Echo Park. He swept our aisles as a kid." "His name?" "Marcus Dell." Keanu Reeves, who had met every famous person on earth, who could have named 100 lawyers who had worked in this town for 40 years, looked at Marta Calloway in the gold light of her office, and he said very gently, "Marta, there is no lawyer named Marcus Dell who grew up in Echo Park. There's no Marcus Dell at all." He paused. "I checked this morning. I checked on the Jansen Group the second you told me the name, because that's what I do, Marta. I check the money that comes near the people I love." He let that land. "The Jansen Group is a Meridian shell. It's been a Meridian shell since 2014. Garrett's father used it to buy foreclosed theaters out from under the families who owned them. I know because they tried to use it on my mother's house in 2016, and I paid off the note myself to keep them out of it." Marta's hand, still holding the pen, went very still. "They didn't pay off your mortgage to save you, Marta," Keanu said. "They paid it off to own it. Somebody at that studio knew you'd never fight them with money, so they made you their creditor. And now, somewhere in that paperwork you signed, in a page you didn't read, and don't be angry, Marta. Don't be angry with yourself. It's not your fault. It's never been your fault. There is a page you signed that gives them more than they ever had before." He came into the office, and he knelt down in front of her chair, the most famous man in the building, kneeling on the worn carpet of a dying theater, and he took her hands, and he said, "Show me the paper, and let me show you what you signed." Marta Calloway looked at him, and she looked at the drawer where she had filed the gift acknowledgement, and for one long moment the office was full of nothing but the sound of the afternoon, and then she said, in a voice so small it barely reached the gold light, "He brought donuts, Keene. He was so kind." "I know," Keanu said. "That's how they do it." And Marta June Calloway, who had believed things her whole life, who had signed her name in the same hand for 48 years, opened the drawer and handed him the poison, and watched him read what she had signed, and watched his face go through 5 different expressions in the space of 10 seconds, and then watched him stop on the 6th, the one that meant he had found it. "Page 5, he said quietly, "the boilerplate release. It's a demolition consent. You've agreed that the restoration funds are contingent on the structure being raised by Monday, and that the lot reverts to Halcyon Capital free of all encumbrances the moment the county files the raise permit." He looked up at her. "Marta, you just signed the demolition order yourself." The pen was still in her hand. She looked down at it, this ordinary thing, this faithful instrument that had signed receipts and birthday cards and her husband's death certificate, and she set it down on the desk the way you set down something hot, and she said, $3 million. "There was never $3 million, Keanu said gently. "There's a shell company and a notary and a lawyer who doesn't exist. And Monday morning, a demolition crew is going to show up with a permit they've held since February. It was never about this week, Marta. It was about the day the option could no longer be stopped. Your mortgage, the covenant, the consent, the whole thing was built 20 years ago to funnel this lot into Meridian's hands the day you couldn't pay, and when you wouldn't sell, they made you sign instead." Marta sat in Joe's chair in her dead husband's office, and she picked up the pen and she put it down and she picked it up again and she said, "I'm 68 years old, Keene. I have been fighting these people for 40 years, and I just handed them the key to my house." She looked at him, and her eyes were dry, and that was somehow worse. "What do I do?" Keanu stood up. He looked at the poster on the wall, Joe's film, silver letters, The Long Way Home, and he said slowly, the way you say a thing you have been carrying for a very long time. "Monday is demolition day. Sunday night is the screening. They think the screening is our last defiance, Marta, a dying woman showing her dead husband's film in her dead building before the wrecking ball. That's what they've planned for. That's the story they've written. They haven't planned for the ending Joe wrote." He turned to her. "The film you're showing Sunday night, it doesn't end the way their remake ends. It ends the way Joe ended it, and everyone who sees it will feel the difference, because it's the difference between a story made by a studio and a story made by a man who knew what it cost to come home to a place that doesn't want you." He came back to the desk and sat down across from her, elbows on the worn wood, the way the boy had sat across from her 40 years ago to ask for her help with his sister. "We're not doing a screening, Marta. We're doing what Joe did in 1986. We're testifying, and they can't stop a testimony with a raise permit." "Garrett Voss can stop anything," Marta said. "He owns the judge, he owns the sheriff, he owns the Sunday papers." "He doesn't own the film," Keanu said. "He's been running from it his whole life. And Sunday night in front of the whole city, he's going to have to watch it walk out of the ground he buried it in." He reached across the desk and took her hand, the boy again, the one who had brought his sick sister to her, the one she had fed soup for 9 months in Van Nuys, and he said, "I keep my promises, Marta. You wrote it on my stub. The day I made my movie, you'd be in the front row. Well, Sunday night, the front row is yours, and I'm going to be standing in it with you." Marta looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked down at the desk, at the grain of the wood where Joe's elbows had rested, where the years had worn a smooth hollow, and she said, in a voice that was mostly air, "He never told me about the clause. Joe never told me about anything. He thought he was protecting me from the weight of it." "He was wrong," Keanu said. "He was wrong," Marta agreed. And she pulled the gift acknowledgement out of the folder, and she tore it in half, and she tore the halves in half, and she dropped the pieces into the wastebasket beside Joe's desk, where the week's receipts and the dead flowers and the years of ordinary paper already slept. "Sunday night," she said. "You bring the projector, I'll bring the film." She paused. "And I'll bring the contract." Keanu's eyes lifted. "What contract?" "The one Harold Voss was so afraid of. He sent his men into a burning building to steal a negative." Marta stood up, and she walked to the filing cabinet against the far wall, the old one, the one that locked, the one Joe had kept for 40 years and Marta had never once opened, out of respect for the dead and fear of the weight, and she put her key in the lock, and she turned it, and the drawer came out with the sound of a coffin lid. "Joe kept a carbon copy of everything he signed," she said. "Every single thing. He called it his graveyard of mistakes. He buried it in the bottom drawer under the floor plans for the lobby renovation he never did." She knelt and she reached in and she pulled out a manila folder, yellow with 40 years, thick with paper, labeled in Joe's hand, Meridian 1986. "He never told me because he never told anyone," Marta said softly. "But he kept it. He always kept everything." She opened the folder. Inside, carbon paper gone to blue ghosts, on paper gone to oatmeal in the careful typing of a 1986 law firm, was the distribution agreement Joe Calloway had signed 2 weeks before the fire, and attached to it, stapled at the corner, the option agreement, the one that gave Meridian the right to purchase the lot. And in the margin of page 3, next to the option clause, in Joe Calloway's own hand, in pen, "Option void if distributor alters, destroys, or damages original negative in any manner, including post-production changes. J.C." And beneath it, in the same hand, smaller, fainter, "Harold read this and shook my hand and said agreed. Witnessed by L. Brine, projectionist." Marta looked up at Keanu and the gold light was in her eyes and she said, "They claim the negative burned, Joe. They claim they never altered it because they say there was nothing left to alter. But they remade your film and they changed your ending and they showed it to the world and the contract says the option dies the day they touch it." She held up the page. Garrett Voss thinks he owns this lot. He's been telling himself that story for 20 years. Sunday night, the whole city gets to hear the real one. Keanu Reeves looked at the yellow page in the hands of a 68-year-old woman in a dying theater, and he said, in a voice that had gone very quiet, "Marta, do you know what you're holding?" "I'm holding the truth," Marta said. "It's the only thing I ever had that they couldn't burn." Part 7. Chapter 7. The Meeting. The meeting happened Saturday morning at 9:00 in a conference room on the 41st floor of the Meridian Tower, a room of glass and gray stone that looked out over the city like a man looking down at a spilled drink. Garrett Voss sat at the head of the table with his jacket off and his tie loosened, which was the closest his body came to an admission of stress. Around him sat the machine, Paul Rayner flat-eyed at his right hand, the general counsel, a woman named Adele Fontaine who had not smiled in 20 years and did not intend to start, two junior lawyers with tablets, and at the far end of the table, in a chair that had been placed there like a chess piece, Marcus Dell, glasses, warm smile, the box of donuts long gone. "It's done," Marcus Dell said. "She signed the consent Friday. The demolition crew is certified and bonded. The raise permit has been on file since February. Monday at 7 the block comes down and the lot reverts to Halcyon, which is us, which has always been us." He smiled his warm smile. "She thanked me. She made me take the donuts." "Her signature," Adele Fontaine said in the voice of a woman checking a rope before hanging. "Witnessed, notarized." "Witnessed by my assistant, notarized by a notary I've used for 9 years. It's clean." "And the screening?" "Sunday night, 7 o'clock. Paul Rayner spoke without looking up from his tablet. 800 seats. We've accounted for the guest list. Sarai Whitfield is bringing roughly 200 industry people, including 3 network anchors and a documentary crew. Keanu Reeves paid a retired projectionist $5,000 cash to reconstruct a projector from parts, and he's been in that building all week installing it like a man building a rocket." He looked up. "They think the screening is the last stand, sir. A dying woman, a dead film, a grand gesture. It's theatrical, it's moving, it's nothing." He set the tablet down. "A screening doesn't stop a raise permit. We have the legal right to take that building Monday morning. We've been advised by counsel," she's sitting right there, "that any attempt to block the demolition will be met with an injunction, and if necessary, a contempt order." Garrett Voss listened. He had been listening for a long time, the way a man listens to the sea when he's afraid of it. "The film," he said, "the print, Lester Brine apparently has it. He had it before I was born." He looked at Rayner. "You've known about this man for how long?" "Since Tuesday," Rayner said without a flicker. "We identified him Tuesday night, the old man across the street with the film can. He's a retired projectionist, 61 years on that lot. We've had eyes on him since. He hasn't left the building since Thursday. He's in there with the projector now." "And the print? What about it?" Garrett Voss leaned forward, and for the first time, something moved behind his eyes, not fear, not anger, something older and colder. "The print is the whole ballgame, Paul. Not the theater, not the lot, not the sentimental fools on the guest list. The print. Do you understand what that film is?" He waited. "My father spent the last 15 years of his life on a deathbed with a secret he carried to the grave. He burned a negative in 1986 to bury a film that was better than anything we made, better than anything we've made since. He did it so Meridian would never have to stand beside the masterpiece it couldn't take credit for. And I have spent 20 years waiting for that print to crawl out of the ground, because I have always known that the day one human being sees it, the remake is Ash, and my father's name is Ash, and this company's founding lie is Ash." He looked at Rayner. "I did not inherit this company to be the one who let it burn. So hear me, and hear me clearly. Monday morning that building comes down, but that print does not leave the building." The room went very quiet. Adele Fontaine looked at her tablet. The junior lawyers looked at the ceiling. "I want it," Garrett said. "I want the print in this building on Monday before the first wall falls. I don't care how. Pay Lester Brine $100,000 in cash and tell him his retirement is a gift from an admirer. Take it from the projector booth while the building's empty. Do whatever you have to do, but do it quietly, and do it before the film ever touches a screen." "Sir," it was Rayner's voice, careful, precise. "If we take the print, we've handed them the story. If the building is demolished with a stolen film inside it, if the world believes the film burned a second time on our orders, the reckoning doesn't just touch the company, it touches you by name. The calculus." "The calculus," Garrett said, "is that my father burned that film once to protect this company and it worked for 40 years. The calculus is that a dead film is a story and a live one is an epitaph." He stood up. "I want it, Paul, tonight, before the screening. Get it done." Rayner looked at him for a beat, the look of a man who has just been handed a live grenade and told it's a gift. And then he nodded once, the way a soldier nods, and he left the room. And Garrett Voss stood at the window, looking down at the city, at the little block of land 5 minutes from downtown that he had been promised was his. And he said to the glass, to himself, to the ghost of his father, "You should have let it burn the first time, you old fool. You should have made sure." Down in the lobby, Marcus Dell walked out through the revolving doors into the Saturday sun, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his portfolio against his chest. And then he took out his phone, and he dialed a number he had carried in his head for 40 years, and when a bass voice answered, an old man's voice, worn with 50 years of film and dust, Marcus Dell said quietly into the traffic, "Mr. Brine, it's Marcus. They're coming for the print tonight, before the screening. They're going to try to take it out of the building while you're all asleep." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Lester Brine's voice, slow as an old projector starting up, "Come on over, son. I'll put the coffee on." And Marcus Dell, the man who had handed Marta the poison and made her take the donuts, put the phone in his pocket and started walking, away from the glass tower, toward Echo Park, toward the theater, toward the last booth in the world that still ran film by hand, and 40 years of a debt came out of the dark to meet him. The theater at 2:00 that afternoon was a hive. Sarai Whitfield had turned the lobby into a war room, clipboards, phones, a young woman with a headset who answered to the name V and seemed to control the weather. The marquee said one show only. The street was full of tripods. And in the projection booth, a narrow room that smelled of oil and dust and 50 years of cigarettes, Lester Brine and Keanu Reeves stood in front of a resurrected machine. A carbon arc projector, 1954, hauled out of a dead theater in Fresno and rebuilt over 4 days by a man of 81 and a movie star who had watched him work with the same patience he brought to everything, which is to say, total. "She's ready," Lester said. He ran his hand along the machine the way you touch a horse you trust. "Threaded her this morning, ran her twice. She's ready." He paused. "You gave a man $5,000 for her. Worth it. A man with your money could have bought the theater and a new one." "Marta doesn't want my money," Keanu said. "She wants her husband's film to be seen. That's a different kind of purchase." He looked at the reel, at the steel can with the wax paper, at the sleeping film that had waited 40 years in a cookie tin in a garage, and he said, "Mr. Brine, do you remember the night you first ran it? 1986. The one night it ever played." Lester went still. The projector hummed between them and the dust turned gold in a shaft of afternoon light, and Lester said slowly, "There were 41 people in that theater. 41. I've counted them every year since, the way other men count sheep." Joe sat in the back row in the dark, not watching the film, watching the audience. Marta ran the candy counter with her sister. And a boy came in off the street, 22 years old, no ticket, said he used to tear tickets there. Said he'd come to see the film because he'd heard the projectionist was the best in the city, that be me. And he was right. And I let him in because he said, "Please, the way you say a prayer." Lester looked at Keanu. That boy sat in the front row alone and watched the film with his hands folded in his lap. And when it ended, when the father sat down on the porch of the house that wasn't there and the screen went dark, the boy didn't move. He sat there for a long time in the dark after the house lights came up. And when he came out, his eyes were red, and he walked up to Joe, who was standing at the back door watching the crowd leave with that look he had, that look like he was holding his breath, and he said, "You made the longest walk I've ever seen, and you didn't cheat the ending." Do you remember what Joe said? Keanu was quiet for a long moment in the gold dust of the booth with the dead machine breathing beside them. He said, Keanu said slowly, "Then you know why I made it. That's all I wanted. One person who knows why." He said that, Lester agreed softly. And then Joe reached into his pocket and gave the boy a ticket stub, Marta's stub, from the front row. "No, wait," he laughed, a dry sound. He gave the boy Marta's stub, the one with her handwriting on it, and he said, "She writes those for the people she believes in. You must be one of them. Keep it." Lester looked at him. And the boy did. He kept it for 40 years. In the booth, in the gold light, Keanu Reeves stood with his hands in his pockets, and he said nothing. And Lester Brine said, "I knew it was you that night, boy, the second you walked in. I've been watching you tear tickets for 2 years before that. And I knew it again last Tuesday, the second you stepped over that barrier like it was a garden hose. Because that's what you did in 1986, isn't it? You came in off the street without a ticket, and you watched a film that changed your life, and 40 years later you made the whole world watch it with you." He reached out and put a hand, old and steady, on the projector's hot side. "Sunday night, you're not just showing a film, boy. You're finishing a sentence you started in the front row when you were 22. Keanu looked at the reel. He looked at the gold dust. He looked at the old man who had kept a secret for 4 decades in a cookie tin, and he said, in a voice that barely reached the booth's small window, "I've made 40 films, Mr. Brine. I've stood on every carpet on earth. And I have spent my whole career, my whole adult life, trying to make something that made one person feel the way that film made me feel that night. That's why I said yes to the remake. Not for the money, not for the studio. Because they came to me with his title, and I thought if I was in it, maybe I could protect it. Maybe I could keep them from touching the ending." He closed his eyes. "I read the script too late. They'd already shot the new ending. They'd already made it soft. I asked them to change it. I argued, I fought. I withheld my approval for 3 weeks, and they held the contract over my head like a hammer because that's what contracts are for." He opened his eyes. "I've been carrying that failure for a year, Mr. Brine. I've been carrying it the way you've been carrying the print." "Then Sunday night," Lester said, "you put it down, both of us. That's what the booth is for." From the stairwell below, a voice floated up, Sarai Whitfield's, bright and urgent. "Keanu, phone, it's the network. They want to send a crew tonight for a preview package. They heard the theater is showing the original restored film." Her voice went a little flat. "And they want to interview Garrett Voss. He's agreed. They're calling it a conversation about preserving cinema history." Keanu and Lester looked at each other. "History," Lester said softly, "is what they say the day after they burn the evidence. Garrett Voss wants to get in front of this story before it gets in front of him. He's gonna smile at the camera and talk about preservation." He shook his head slowly. "Boy, you'd better call Marta. She's gonna want to hear this." Down in the office, Marta Calloway stood at the window with the afternoon sun full on her face, holding the phone, listening to the machine on the other end of the line, the network producer, the one Sarai had called in a favor for, and what the producer said was, "Mrs. Calloway, we want to air a 2-hour retrospective. Sunday night. We'd need to broadcast the screening live, the whole thing, uncut. We're prepared to pay a licensing fee to the rights holders of the original film, and we're prepared to indemnify you against any claims by Meridian. But we need your answer in the next hour, because the network wants to promote it tonight." Marta Calloway looked out at the marquee, at the letters she had hung herself, "One show only," and she thought about Joe, about the night he stood at the back door with that held-breath look, about the one person who had known why, about the 41 people and the boy in the front row, and she said into the phone in a voice with 40 years of dust in it, "You'll show it uncut. You'll show the ending he wrote, and you'll put a title card up that says what this film is and who made it." "Agreed," the producer said. "Sunday night live." Marta hung up. She stood at the window a moment longer, and then she did something she had not done in 40 years. She opened Joe's bottom drawer, the one she had opened Friday in front of Keanu, and she took out not the contract but the other thing in the folder, the thing she had not shown anyone. A photograph. Black and white, 1986, the lobby of the Echo Park Theater, the night of the one and only screening. 41 people in coats, a boy in the front row with his hands folded in his lap, and in the corner of the frame behind the candy counter, a woman with dark hair in a white blouse, Marta, 28 years old, laughing at something off camera, and beside her, shoulder to shoulder, a man in a dark suit with a shy smile, watching the crowd the way you watch a garden you've planted. Joe. Joe had never seen her keep it. She had taken it from the film's files the week after the funeral, when the world was telling her her husband had made a failure, and she had hidden it, the way you hide a photograph of a person you can't bear to look at and can't bear to lose. "I'm showing it Sunday, Joe," Marta said to the photograph, to the ghost, to the 40-year silence. "The whole thing, every last step of the walk." She put the photograph back in the drawer on top of the contract, and she closed the drawer, and she stood in the office in the gold light, and she said to the empty room in a voice that was almost steady, "The only thing they could ever take from you was the audience. Sunday night, Joe, we're giving it back." Saturday night at the Echo Park Theater. The street was quiet, the marquee glowed one show only, and inside the lights were low and the doors were locked, and the theater slept the way old theaters sleep, with one eye open. In the projection booth, Lester Brine had fallen asleep in the cracked leather chair that had been his bed for 3 nights, his hands folded over his flat cap, the film can beside him on the floor like a dog at his feet. At 1:40 in the morning, the side door opened. 3 men came in through the loading bay. They were not burglars. Burglars are nervous, and these men moved like men with a schedule. They wore work clothes and tool belts, and 2 of them carried a long metal case, and they walked through the dark theater with a flashlight that never once swept the seats. It went straight up the aisle, straight to the stairwell, straight to the booth, the way a man who has been shown a floor plan walks through a house he has never visited. They found the booth door unlocked, which should have been their first warning, and the room empty, which should have been their second, and the film can open on the floor, with the steel reel inside it, gleaming under their flashlight, which should have been their third warning, and was not, because men with schedules do not look for warnings. The first man knelt. He lifted the reel. It was light, too light. The film had been rewound off the core, the steel reel held nothing but the spool, and the spool in the beam of the flashlight showed the unmistakable gap of a reel that had been stripped. The man looked at his partner. His partner looked at the doorway, where a light had come on, a work light, an old one, the kind that hangs in projection booths. And beneath the light stood Lester Brine in his flat cap, holding nothing, the way you hold nothing when you have already moved everything that matters. "I already ran it twice tonight, boys," Lester said, in his slow bass, the voice of a man who had been threading film in the dark since before most of the city was born. "It's not here." The first man stepped forward. "Mr. Brine, we've been sent by." "I know who sent you." Lester did not move. "I've been waiting for you since 1986. You're late." He looked at the 3 men, not with anger, with something closer to exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man who has spent 40 years living next to a war that never ended. "You're going to want to check the theater, the office, the basement, and the candy counter. I'll save you the trouble. It's in none of them. It's in a place you can't get to tonight, and you can't get to tomorrow, and you can't get to before Sunday at 7, because the only man who knows where it is, besides me, is standing in the booth of the Signora right now, waiting for the same thing you are." He paused. "You boys have a good night. Tell whoever sent you that the film sleeps where it's safe, and it wakes up Sunday." The first man looked at the reel, at the stripped spool, at the 61-year projectionist standing under the work light, and he did what men with schedules do when the schedule breaks. He called it in. The phone on the other end was answered on the second ring by Paul Rayner, who listened and who said in his flat voice, "Search the building. Then search it again. Then wait." They searched the building. They searched the office where Marta's paperwork slept in folders. They searched the basement, the boiler room, the old furnace, the crawl space under the stage where the smell of dust was 40 years deep. They searched the candy counter, the concession stand, the ticket booth, the marquee's electrical closet. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. The film was a rumor in a city of rumors, sleeping somewhere a man with a schedule could not reach before Sunday. And at 3:10 in the morning, Paul Rayner, standing at the window of the Meridian Tower in his shirt sleeves, looking down at the dark block of Echo Park, said into the phone to the man in the booth, "Fine, Sunday it is." He paused. "And Mr. Brine, when the film comes out of hiding Sunday night, you tell your people to enjoy it while they can. Because Monday morning the building comes down regardless, and whatever's inside it comes down with it." Lester Brine hung up the phone in the booth and sat down in the chair, and he looked at the stripped spool and he said to the dark, "That's what they said in '86, Harold. That's what they always say." He put his cap back on and he went down to the lobby, where a man was waiting in the dark, Marcus Dell, in a windbreaker, sitting on the edge of the candy counter like a boy who had been caught watching matinees through the emergency exit, and Lester said, "They'll be back." "I know," Marcus said. "I told you they would, that's why I called you first." He looked at the old projectionist. "Did you move it?" "I moved it." "Where?" "Where it can't be found by men who carry schedules." Lester sat down beside him on the counter, and for a moment the two men sat in the dark of the theater, the 61-year projectionist and the lawyer who had handed Marta the poison, and Lester said, "You know, son, I spent 40 years thinking you were one of them. Then you came back. You handed Marta a box of donuts and a demolition consent, and I thought my last judgment of men was wrong twice in 1 week." He looked at Marcus. "Why'd you do it? The donuts and the consent, you did exactly what they paid you for, and then you called me." Marcus Dell sat very still. "Because I swept these aisles," he said finally. "Because Marta Calloway is the only adult who ever looked at me, at a kid who couldn't afford a movie ticket, who watched through a gap in a door and saw a boy worth putting on the payroll. Because I've spent 30 years getting rich off people who don't know what that's like, and Tuesday night I watched her get walked backward off a red carpet by 2 men in black, and I went home and I couldn't sleep because I knew who was behind it, because I've known for 30 years who was behind everything." He looked at the old man. "Garrett Voss doesn't know I know. He thinks I'm his. He thinks the donuts were the trick." He shook his head. "The donuts were real, Mr. Brine. The restitution is real. I've been waiting 40 years for a night like Sunday." "Then Sunday you'll get what you came for," Lester said. "But tonight we finish it. Come on. I'll show you where the film sleeps." At 4:00 in the morning in the basement of the Echo Park Theater, beneath a false floor panel that Joe Calloway had built himself in 1974, a panel that had never once been opened by anyone but Joe, and then Lester, and now Keanu, the steel reel rested in the dark on a bed of wax paper, safe as a secret, patient as the 40 years it had already waited. Lester Brine closed the panel. He stood up. He looked at Marcus Dell and Keanu Reeves, the three of them in the dust of the basement in the light of a single bulb, and he said, "Sunday at 6:30 we bring her up, thread her at 6:45. House open at 7. He looked at the panel. "She's been waiting a long time to be seen, boys. Let's not make her wait any longer." Chapter 9, The Last Day. Sunday morning came up gray and gold over Echo Park, and the theater woke to a street already filling with television trucks. Sarai Whitfield's War Room had gone national overnight. The network had promoted the live broadcast at halftime of a football game, and the country that had spent a week arguing about an old woman and a red carpet and a movie star who stepped over a barrier like it was a garden hose, decided, in the way countries do, that it needed to see how this one ended. At 10:00 a.m., Garrett Voss sat in a chair on a soundstage at the network's Burbank lot, in a suit the color of ash, being interviewed by a woman named Cora James, who had won 2 Peabodys and was not afraid of him. The interview was billed as a conversation about preserving cinema history, and for 19 minutes, Garrett Voss performed the man he had rehearsed his whole life. Regretful, forward-looking, a steward of the art form, deeply moved, he said, by the outpouring of support for the Echo Park Theater. Deeply committed, he said, to a future in which the building might find new life, deeply aware, he said, of the community's feelings. And Cora James, who had done her homework, who had read the old trade papers, who had a file on the 1986 fire that made her eyes narrow as she turned a page, Cora James said, in her quiet, deadly voice, "Mr. Voss, the film being screened tonight at the Echo Park Theater, The Long Way Home, was, as your company has long stated, destroyed in a vault fire in 1986. The screening tonight apparently features a surviving print. Can you confirm that Meridian holds the rights to that film?" Garrett Voss smiled the magnificent smile. "Of course. Meridian has held the rights since 1986. We acquired them legitimately, and we would celebrate the emergence of any material that sheds light on the work of Joe Calloway, a filmmaker we have long admired." He spread his hands. "In fact, if tonight's screening is genuine, we'll be thrilled. History restored, cinema preserved. That's the story we want to tell." "You'd welcome it," Cora James said. "Then why, Mr. Voss, did someone on your payroll cross Marta Calloway's name off the guest list last Tuesday night, 21 minutes before she arrived at the premiere of the remake of the very film being shown tonight?" The pause was 1 second. It was the longest second of Garrett Voss's life. "I have no knowledge of that," he said, "and I'd caution you against repeating an allegation." "No allegation, Mr. Voss." Cora James smiled, and it was not a warm smile. "We obtained the original paper guest list from the Signora's event coordinator this morning. Marta Calloway's name is there in the VIP section marked Keanu's guest, and below it, struck through in pen hard enough to tear the paper, the same name." She held up a photograph of it. The camera zoomed. The country leaned in. "The time stamp shows the list was printed at 6:15. The strike-through appears to have been made after that by a pen. Whose pen, Mr. Voss?" "I would have to." And Cora James said, "We have a second document." She held up another photograph. "A gift acknowledgement signed by Marta Calloway on Friday in which she agreed to a demolition covenant, a document that has been described to her by your own attorney, a Mr. Marcus Dell, as a boilerplate release. Mr. Dell's firm is retained by Meridian. Can you confirm that?" The camera found Garrett Voss's hands square on his knees, knuckles white, and the country saw them, and the country understood in the way countries understand, that it was watching a man being buried alive on live television, and there was nothing he could do about it. "Mr. Voss," Cora James said, "is Meridian attempting to demolish the Echo Park Theater tomorrow morning under a demolition consent obtained from a 68-year-old woman who believed she was signing a charitable gift?" "I think," Garrett Voss began, and his voice cracked just once, the voice of a man who had been rehearsing his whole life for a performance that had just been canceled. "I think we're going to need to end the interview. The network has reserved the hour, Mr. Voss." And Garrett Voss, the CEO of Meridian Pictures, sat in the chair, and he looked at the camera the way a man looks at a wave he has been watching come for him his entire life, and he said, in a voice the country had never heard from him, "You don't understand what you're stepping into." "Then help me understand," Cora James said gently. "Help the country understand why the name of a 68-year-old woman was crossed off a list, and why she was handed a demolition consent disguised as charity, and why your company has spent 40 years insisting that a film, which is being shown tonight in an 800-seat theater in front of the entire country, was destroyed in a fire." She leaned forward. "What's in that film, Mr. Voss?" Garrett Voss opened his mouth. Nothing came out. And for the first time in his life on live television in front of 60 million people, the machine of Garrett Voss, the smile, the boardroom, the magnificent confidence stopped working, and there was only a man, 52 years old, looking at a question he had been running from his whole life. At 4:00 that afternoon, Marta Calloway stood in the lobby of the theater in a blue dress, the good dress, the one she wore to weddings and funerals, the one that had been her mother's, and she looked at the marquee through the glass door. The letters had been changed that morning. They said now, "The long way home, one night only," and below in smaller letters a line she had written herself with a marker in the same hand that had signed 48 years of everything, final showing. DOORS 6:30. Sarah Whitfield came down the stairs in a black dress and stood beside her. "The country is going to watch you show your husband's film tonight, in a building slated for demolition tomorrow, live on network television, with the CEO of the studio that stole it watching from his couch." She said it like a question. "Yes," Marta said, "that's the plan." "Are you scared?" Marta considered it, the way you consider a coat before you put it on. "In 1986, she said, "there were 41 people in that theater, and I was so scared I couldn't feel my hands. I ran the candy counter and I couldn't feel my hands for the whole 97 minutes. She looked at the marquee. "Tonight there will be 800 people in this theater and 60 million watching from home, and I can feel my hands fine," Sarah bait. "Because I already lost everything once and I found out you don't die of it. You just keep walking." She said it the way Joe would have said it, the way Joe had said it in the film, and Sarah Whitfield looked at her and did not know whether to laugh or cry, and did both, quietly, and put her arm through the old woman's arm, and the two of them stood in the lobby of the dying theater in the gold light of the last afternoon and waited for the doors to open. Part 9. Chapter 10. The Screening. At 6:15, the doors of the Echo Park Theater opened and the city came in. They came the way the country had come all week, not in ones, in waves. The actors who had stepped off the carpet Tuesday night, 24 of them in their good clothes, without publicists, without entourages, the way you come to a funeral or a wedding or a thing you know matters. Sarah Whitfield in black, taking her seat in row C, seat 4, beside the empty seat where Marta would sit. Marcus Bell, the star of the remake, in a suit he had worn to his own father's funeral, sitting in the back row the way he had sat in the back row of every theater in his childhood, because his family had never been able to afford the front. Ryan Ortiz, the kid in glasses, the one nobody had photographed, in a jacket he had borrowed from his roommate, holding a phone that was already live, because he had promised his 800 subscribers they wouldn't miss it. The network's cameras bolted to the balcony like a second audience, their red lights already burning. The documentary crew, the rival studio executives, the 3 retired projectionists in a row with Lester Brine in the middle, in his flat cap, holding a reel the way a priest holds a book. And then at 6:28, the front row filled. A quiet ripple went through the house, the way water knows when something is about to break, because the front row, row A, the row that had belonged to nobody for 40 years, filled with the people of Echo Park. The barber from the corner who had cut Joe's hair since 1958, the taco stand woman who had fed the theater's crew for 30 years, the kids from the block who had swept aisles on Tuesdays for their dimes, the dominoes players from the sidewalk, the whole neighborhood, the people who had kept this building alive with their quarters and their loyalty and their love. And the neighborhood sat down in the front row, and the country watching at home understood, without being told, that the front row belonged to the people who had always been there. Marta came out at 6:31 in her mother's blue dress, through the door that said staff only, and the house rose. 800 people, rising, the sound of them like a field of birds taking off, and Marta stood in the aisle in her mother's blue dress, and she did not know what to do with her hands, so she held them the way she had held the ticket stub, the way you hold a candle, and the applause went on, and the cameras caught her eyes, bright and dry, and the country at home, 60 million strong, stood up too, in living rooms from Los Angeles to Ohio to Florida to Texas to the little towns in between. And they did not know each other, and they did not know her, and they stood anyway, the way you stand for a flag you didn't design, and a country you didn't build, and a woman you didn't know. Keanu walked her down the aisle. He had not planned the escort. He had simply appeared at her elbow the way he appeared everywhere, like weather, and she took his arm because it was there. And the cameras found them, and the country had already decided a week ago what it thought of this man, and the country was not wrong. Marta sat down in row C, seat 5, and Keanu sat beside her, and Lester Brine in the booth in his flat cap with 40 years of waiting in his hands, threaded the film one last time and looked down through the little window at the packed house below, 800 seats, every one of them full, and he said softly to the machine, to the dust, to the ghost of Joe Calloway, "You said you wanted one person who knew why, Joe. Look at the house." The lights went down. The film began. And in living rooms across America, 60 million people watched Joe Calloway's film for the first time. The film the world had been told was Ash, and they watched it the way you watch a thing you have been waiting 40 years to see, which is to say, the way the whole country had been waiting all week and hadn't known it. The film was not perfect. It was shot in 11 days on a budget that could not have bought the remake's craft services trailer. The sound was thin in places. The light was what they could afford. The lead actor was a man from the neighborhood who had worked at a garage and had never been in front of a camera before, and who was, in the way of first miracles, unforgettable. And the ending Joe had written, the one the studio had spent 40 years burying, the one the remake had softened into a reunion, the ending came, and the country held its breath. The father, the neighborhood's man, the garage mechanic, the accidental actor, walked the last stretch of the road home, and the house that wasn't there anymore was there in the way houses are there when you need them to be, in memory, in the shape of the light. And he sat down on the porch step that had been carried away 40 years ago, and he waited. The camera did not move. The film did not cut. He just sat there, the way you sit when you have walked your whole life to arrive, and the screen went dark. And for one long moment in the Echo Park Theater in 800 seats, among 60 million living rooms, there was only silence, the silence of a country finishing in its own heart, the last few steps of the walk. And then in the back row, a man stood up. Marcus Bell, the star of the remake, the man whose face had been on the posters, who had made his name and his fortune and his awards from the softened ending, who had been sitting in the dark of the back row with his hands folded in his lap the way he had sat in the back rows of his childhood. Marcus Bell stood up, and he did not wipe his face, and he walked down the aisle, and the cameras followed him, and the country leaned in. And Marcus Bell walked to the front of the theater and stood in front of the screen in the projector's light, and he said to the house, in a voice that had to work to stay steady, "I want to apologize. I made that remake. I gave them my face and my name and my talent to sand the edges off a masterpiece, because I believed them when they told me the audience couldn't handle the truth." He looked at the screen, at the darkness where the father had been sitting on the porch that wasn't there. "That was the best film I have ever been in, and I wasn't in it. Joe Calloway made it and I helped bury it." He turned to row C, to Marta. "Mrs. Calloway, I'm sorry." The house was silent. Marta stood up slowly in her mother's blue dress, and she looked at the man who had made his career from her husband's story, and she said, in a voice that carried, "Marcus Bell, do you remember what the father says to the boy in the film?" Marcus Bell blinked. He hadn't expected the question. He says, he closed his eyes. He says, "The walk doesn't end when you get home, son. It ends when you stop pretending the road was easy." He says that, Marta agreed. And then he sits down on the porch and he waits. She looked at him. "You're on the porch now, Marcus. You're doing the walk." And she held out her hand, and Marcus Bell came forward, and he took it. And the house, 800 people in the Echo Park Theater and 60 million in living rooms across the country. The house did what houses do when they can't hold it anymore. It broke, all at once, into applause, the kind of applause that isn't for a performance, the kind that's for a thing you watched someone do that was hard and true. And then a voice came from the balcony, Cora James's voice, through the network's microphone, cutting through the applause with the precision of a scalpel. "Mrs. Calloway, may I ask you one question on behalf of the country?" Marta looked up. The cameras swung. In living rooms across America, 60 million people leaned forward. "Of course," Marta said. "Your husband's contract with Meridian," Cora James said, "contains a provision in Mr. Calloway's own hand, witnessed by his projectionist, that the studio's option on this property is void if the negative is ever altered, damaged, or destroyed. The studio has claimed for 40 years that the negative burned in 1986, but the film we just watched exists. She paused, and the pause was a national breath. The company that demolished your husband's life's work and then remade it with a different ending, and then tried to demolish your theater on Monday. Will you be enforcing that provision, Mrs. Calloway? On Monday morning, when the wrecking ball arrives, what happens? The silence in the theater was total. Marta June Calloway stood in the projector's light, 68 years old in her mother's blue dress, in the building her husband had built, and she looked up at the balcony, and then she looked out at the house, row A, the neighborhood, row C, the people she loved, the back row, the stars who had stood up for her, the booth, where a tired old man in a flat cap was crying into the projector's heat, and she said in a voice that the whole country heard, in a voice with 40 years of dust and gold in it, "I never wanted to tear anything down. I wanted to show the world what my husband made before they tore it down for me." She reached into her pocket and took out a folded paper, the contract page, the yellow one, the one with Joe's handwriting in the margin, and she held it up, not in triumph, the way you hold a ticket for a train you have been waiting your whole life to board. "Monday morning, there's a hearing. I'm going to walk into that courtroom, and I'm going to put this on the judge's bench, and I'm going to tell him what it says. And then I'm going to sit down in the front row of his courtroom the way I sat in the front row here, and I'm going to let the law do the walk." The house rose again. It rose the way it had risen for her at 6:31, but this time it was different. This time it was 800 people standing up, not for an entrance but for an answer, and the cameras caught the whole of it, and the country at home stood with them. And for one long moment, one of those moments that happens once in a generation, the kind you remember where you were, the entire country was standing in the dark with a woman who had walked her whole life to arrive at a porch step that no longer existed, and who had decided, in front of everyone, to keep walking. In the booth, Lester Brine took off his flat cap and he held it against his chest, the way you hold a hat at a funeral, and he said to the dark above the projector, to the ghost, to the 40-year silence, "She's on the porch, Joe. She made it. Look at the house." Part 10. Chapter 11, The Hearing. Monday morning came up gray over Los Angeles, the way it does when the city is holding its breath. At 6:45, a wrecking ball on a crane idled at the curb of Echo Park, diesel smoke rising into the wet air, its operator in the cab with the engine running, waiting for the phone call that would tell him to move. The street was not empty. It had never been empty. The neighborhood had been out there since 5:00 that morning, lining the sidewalk, the barbershop regulars, the taco stand family, the dominoes players, the mothers with strollers, the kids who had swept aisles for dimes, standing between the wrecking ball and the marquee that still said one show only, not chanting, not shouting, just standing, the way they had stood every Tuesday for 60 years, in front of the only thing the neighborhood had ever had that was built for beauty. At 8:58 in a courtroom in the county building, 5 blocks away, Judge Keanu Reeves, a woman of 63 with gray hair cut short and glasses on a chain, a woman who had been on the bench for 19 years and had seen every kind of lie a man can tell with a contract in his hand, looked down at the papers in front of her, and then looked at the woman standing at the plaintiff's table and said, "Mrs. Calloway, you appear without counsel." "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you understand the consequences of that?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Reeves looked at her for a long moment, the way you look at a horse you're about to bet on, and then she nodded once and she said, "Proceed." The courtroom was full. It was always full in the stories, and it was full here. Sarah Whitfield in the first row, Keanu Reeves in the second, Lester Brine in the third with his cap in his lap, Marcus Bell against the wall, the documentary crew in the back with a lens the size of a small dog, and the press, and the public, and the country watching through the cameras the network had been granted leave to bring, because Judge Reeves had read the papers, and Judge Reeves had eyes. Marta Calloway stood at the table, and she put the yellow page on the bench, Joe's page, the contract, the option, the handwritten margin, and she said, in a voice that never rose, "Your Honor, my husband, Joseph Calloway, signed this agreement with Meridian Pictures in 1986. He was a projectionist's son who grew up in Echo Park and built a theater with his own hands. He made one film. One. He borrowed money against this building. The building Meridian now wants to tear down to pay for it, because he believed in it the way only a man who has nothing else can believe in a thing. 2 weeks after he signed this paper, the film's negative burned in a Meridian vault fire. The studio paid us $12,000 and told us to sign a release. My husband never recovered from it." She paused, and the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent hum. "He died in 1986, Your Honor. He died 6 months after the fire of a heart attack at 51, and the doctors said it was his heart, and I have always known it was the film. The film was his heart." She picked up the page. "This agreement says the option, Meridian's right to buy this property, is void if the distributor alters, damages, or destroys the original negative in any manner, including post-production changes." She set it down. In the margin in my husband's hand it says, "Harold read this and shook my hand and said agreed. Witnessed by L. Brine, projectionist. Your Honor, last night in this city, in my theater, before 800 people and the entire country, Meridian's own remake of my husband's film was screened, and beside it, the original print that the studio spent 40 years telling the world had burned. The original exists. Meridian's remake changed its ending, and Monday, today, Meridian intends to demolish the building that the contract's option would have given them, if the contract's option were still alive." The courtroom was silent. "Your Honor," Marta said, "I'm asking you to declare that option void. I'm asking you to return this property to the only hands that ever loved it." She looked down at the page at the ghost of her husband's handwriting, and her voice went very quiet, the way it goes quiet when you're saying the truest thing you know. "And I'm asking you to tell Meridian, tell them what my husband never got to hear anybody say. The film was never theirs. The ending was never theirs, and neither is the lot." At the table for the respondent sat 4 lawyers in 4 dark suits, and behind them, in the first row of the gallery, sat Garrett Voss. He had come. He had sent his army of lawyers, but he had come himself, because the country was watching, and a man who is watching his life's work burn in real time needs to be present for the fire. He sat very still in the ash-gray suit, and he looked at the old woman at the plaintiff's table, and behind his eyes, running so fast nobody could see it, was the arithmetic of the last 3 days. The interview, the guest list, the gift acknowledgement, the donuts, the empty reel in the booth, the film that had played to 60 million people, the country standing in its living rooms, and now this, a judge, a page, a woman with nothing left to lose. The lead attorney for Meridian, a man named Hollis Crane, who had been the studio's fixer for 30 years, stood up and he said, "Your Honor, the respondent respectfully submits that the so-called original print screened last night has not been authenticated. It may be a copy, a forgery, a reconstruction." The studio's position, unchanged for 40 years, is that the negative was destroyed in a fire, that the distribution agreement's terms were fully performed, and that the option remains valid and exercisable. Mrs. Calloway's remedy, if any, lies in a different forum, on a different record, and the demolition order was issued. "Mr. Crane," Judge Ray's voice cut through like a blade through room-temperature butter. "The demolition order, as I read the file, was obtained on Friday from Mrs. Calloway herself, under a document described to her as a charitable gift acknowledgement, tendered by a foundation that does not exist, acting through an attorney retained by your client." She looked at him over her glasses. "You'll forgive me if I don't treat that as a model of clean hands." "Your Honors." "Sit down, Mr. Crane." Hollis Crane sat down. In the gallery, Garrett Voss's jaw did something that the cameras caught, and the country saw it. The moment the machine of Garrett Voss finally, fully, stopped. Judge Ray's looked at the yellow page for a long moment. Then she looked at Marta. "Mrs. Calloway, You married a man who believed in people. It was not a question, it was a statement delivered with a kind of wonder. The record before me, the contract, the margin note, the witness, the surviving print, the 40-year public record of a studio insisting that print could not exist, is, in 40 years on this bench, the plainest case of a wrong I have ever been asked to right. She set the page down precisely, the way you set down a thing you are about to rule on, and she said, I find the option clause void ab initio, void from the beginning. I find that Meridian Pictures, its subsidiaries, and its assigns hold no right, title, or interest in the property at 1412 Echo Park Avenue, commonly known as the Echo Park Theater, and I order that the demolition order issued Friday be vacated, and that the county records be corrected to reflect that the property is owned free and clear by its lawful owner, Marta June Calloway. She paused. I also find that the representation made to Mrs. Calloway on Friday, that a charitable foundation intended to restore her theater, was a knowing deception used to secure her signature, and I am referring the matter to the district attorney's office for review. The counsel of record who presented that document to a woman he knew to be acting without counsel will be appearing before me at 2 o'clock this afternoon to show cause why his license should not be suspended. The courtroom erupted. It erupted the way the country erupted, not in noise, in something else, something that came up out of 800 assembled chests and 60 million living rooms at once, a sound that was part tide and part thunder and part release. Sarai Whitfield was crying. Marcus Bell was on his feet. Lester Brine stood in the back row in his flat cap, and he did not wipe his face, and he was not ashamed. And Garrett Voss, the CEO of Meridian Pictures, sat in the first row of the gallery in his ash-gray suit, and he watched the room rise around him, the way the room had risen for the woman in the blue dress. And he understood, in the way a man understands a diagnosis, that it was over. The company that had burned a masterpiece to protect its lie had spent 40 years building a monument to that lie, and the monument had finally learned to feel shame, and the shame was his. He stood up. He did it slowly, the way a man stands up after a long illness. He walked out of the courtroom, past the cameras, past the press, past the country, and at the door he stopped. The whole room went quiet, and he turned, and he looked back at Marta Calloway, and he said, in a voice that had never once been heard in public, a voice that was very tired, "My father burned your husband's film because he couldn't stand to live in the shadow of a better man. I've spent my whole life trying to prove him right." He paused. He was wrong. And Garrett Voss walked out of the courtroom, and the country watched him go, and nobody in that room, nobody in 60 million living rooms, would ever be able to say they didn't see the moment a machine became a man, and a man became a smaller thing, and a smaller thing walked out into the gray Lowe's Angels morning to live the rest of his life with the arithmetic. Part 11. Chapter 12. The Porch. The hearing made the papers. The story made the country. But the morning after Tuesday, the day the theater had been scheduled to die, Marta Calloway did what she had done every morning for 48 years. She opened the front door at 9:00 in her apron with the broom, and she swept the sidewalk, and the trucks were gone, and the wrecking ball was gone, and the street was full of sunlight, and the marquee still said the long way home, and the neighborhood came out the way it always came out, and the barber brought her coffee, and she stood on the sidewalk in the sun in her apron, holding the broom. And for the first time in 40 years, she cried, not the tired, leaking kind, not the grief kind. The other kind, the kind you do at the end of a walk, standing on a porch that is still there, in front of a door that is still yours. The restoration fund she had been promised was never real, but the one that went up in its place was real, an actual foundation, not a shell, a real one, endowed by an anonymous group that included a movie star, an actress, an attorney, and a man who had spent 30 years getting rich off people who didn't know what it was like to sweep a theater aisle for a dime. And the foundation did what Marta had always done. It put the building back in the hands of the neighborhood. The Echo Park Theater reopened in the spring as the Calloway, a community cinema where the Tuesday matinees were $1, where the kids who couldn't afford tickets swept aisles for dimes and titles, where the front row belonged to the people who had always been there, and where once a year in March, on the anniversary of the one and only night, the theater showed a single film, one night only, The Longest Walk in the World, and the house rose. And the old woman in her mother's blue dress stood in the projector's light, and the country that had stood up for her, stood up again, in its living rooms and watched. Lester Brine kept running the projector until he was 90, and then he trained a boy and then a girl, and then he sat in row C with his cap on his knee and watched them run it, and he said every time to whoever was sitting next to him, "She's a good machine. She knows the way home." He died in the booth at 94 with his hands on the machine, which is the way projectionists die when they are lucky, and the neighborhood buried him with the reel, the original print, donated to the archive by Marta, with a single frame cut out and pressed into his hands, the frame of the father sitting on the porch, which is the frame Joe would have picked. Marcus Bell made one more film in his life, an original, not a remake, a small picture about a long walk, and he dedicated it to the woman in the blue dress, and he never sanded an edge again. Sarah Whitfield produced a documentary called The Front Row about a theater, a film, and a guest list, and it won a prize, and she gave the prize to the Callaway, and the plaque hangs in the lobby beside a framed ticket stub from 1986, front row, in a woman's hand. "The day you make your movie, I'll be there." Keanu Reeves stayed in Echo Park longer than anyone expected. He had a house. He had 40 films. He had a career that could have taken him anywhere on earth, and night after night in that first year, he was at the Callaway in the booth, learning the machine from Lester, or in the candy counter, selling popcorn to kids who had no idea who he was, or in the back row, watching the neighborhood watch the screen, the way he had watched a film alone in the front row when he was 22. He never made a speech about it. He never explained. When a reporter finally cornered him, years later, and asked why he kept coming back to a little theater in Echo Park when he could be anywhere, Keanu Reeves looked at the reporter the way he looked at everything, with that particular patience, and he said, "Because the front row was promised to someone else 40 years ago, and I was the one who got to sit in it." The reporter didn't understand. The country did. And Marta June Callaway lived to be 91, in the apartment above the theater, in the room that had been Joe's office, sleeping in the bed that had been her mother's, sweeping the sidewalk every morning whether it needed it or not, because a woman who has run a theater for 60 years knows that a sidewalk is the first thing people see and it ought to be swept. She never remarried. She never wanted to. She had loved one man with her whole life, and she had spent 40 years carrying the weight of what was done to him. And on a Tuesday morning in the sun, with the broom in her hands and the marquee saying her name, she found out that the weight had been lifted, not all at once, the way it comes down, but slowly, the way it goes, the way a road goes, the way a walk goes, one step at a time, until you look up and you're home. She died the way she had lived, in the spring, in the night, after the annual screening, with the projector's light going out and the house rising for the last time in her honor and the country, in its living rooms, standing up one last time for the woman in the blue dress. And in the morning when they found her, she was holding a ticket stub, 40 years old, pencil gone soft and gray, on the back in a young man's hand, "I owe you one premiere, front row." K, and beneath it in her own hand, added in the last weeks of her life, in the same steady script that had signed 48 years of everything, paid in full.